I'm going to set this to record. That's my note to turn the recording on. So let's get started here. On your device, and each device is different, so this may look a little bit different on whatever you're using, but you should find these same buttons or icons somewhere on there. The first one I want to bring your attention to is the Leave Meeting. This one right here that's in red. If for some reason you do need to leave this meeting, you would just press that button and it would exit you out of our webinar. If you want to come back, you can come back the same way you came in. So if you need to, step away for a moment, you are welcome to come back. The next set of buttons are going to be grouped together in another location, and I'm going to highlight them here for us. So there's a raise hand button. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Actually, let's not use that for questions. Sometimes I ask things like, how many of you have this? So let's use that feature for that today. Question and answers are really best to be put into that Q&A right here. And the reason is if you hit that button and type a question in, it stays in that area until I answer it, so I can't miss it. Unlike chat, where chat is more, you're communicating with me something like, I can't hear, I can't see, something along those lines. So the chat kind of scrolls, and sometimes I can lose a question in chat. So the best place to put a question really is in that Q&A section. Just to let you know, your cameras are off, your microphones are off. I won't be able to hear or see you. So our really only means of communication is through the chat or the Q&A. This is a webinar. So because it is online, and I realize that, we have these kind of different times these days, we're still at a place where we're only allowed to meet with 10 or few people. So having classes is just not really a wise thing for us to do right now, since we're so limited on our attendance. So this has been a really great way for us to still be able to connect with you and still get our research education information out there. So it is a little bit of a challenge, however, because it's just kind of a one-way interaction. I'll try to keep you engaged by asking you to type some things in chat or to ask questions, but it is a little dull sometimes if you're distracted. So please limit your distractions. Thank you in advance if there are any issues. Sometimes technology can be a little bit of an issue. Remember to use the chat if you have any problems. If something, all of a sudden you can't hear me anymore, it may be on my end and I may need to adjust something. So please feel free to use that. Just like that. Okay, all right, so back to our title page. So today we're going to talk about drought tolerant plants. I'm glad that you've joined us. I'm glad that you're interested in this topic. Unfortunately, right now, as you're fully aware, I'm sure, we have had an inundation of rain, so drought tolerant plants aren't high on anybody's priority list right now, I'm sure, but our seasons are changing and we're coming out of that rainy season as soon as hurricane season is over. But we're coming out of the rainy season and we're headed into fall, and our typical fall here in Florida is windy and dry. And that's when we do start needing some of those more drought tolerant plants to make it through our less rainy times. Okay, so we're going to cover a few things today because this is part of our mobile irrigation program. We do cover the rebate program that's in place here in Manatee County. We'll cover some Florida-friendly landscaping principles, of course, drought-tolerant plants, what that means, and then what you should really be leaving on the shelf. There we go. All right, so Manatee County has a wonderful rebate program for Manatee County utility customers, sorry. So there's a few qualifications to be able to qualify for this rebate program, and there's a few different levels to the program. So one of the things that they offer is a 50% up to $500, which honestly doesn't really cover the cost of a cistern, but they do have a program for a cistern. And just to let you know, we had an intern in place this summer and have looked at restructuring this rebate program. Because it is a legal document, it takes more than just us making a few changes. We have to take it to the Board of County Commissioners. That has to go through our attorney, but we are looking to make some changes and improve this program. So stay tuned. So cistern is on the list. That's one of the things that can be covered under our rebate program. Also using alternative sources of water. If you were to decide as a community to start using your lakes for irrigation, then the cost of getting that plumbed to do that could be covered. An irrigation well or community well can both be covered 50% up to $1,000. And I'm going to tell you that's not going to cover the cost of the well either. $1,000 isn't going to get too far with a well, but if you're planning to put in a well, then it is something for you. Also, the rain sensor shutoff. If you do not have a functioning rain sensor, then that is actually covered 100% up to $125. So that's probably the best valued item on the rebate list. Soil moisture sensors are a newer technology that go in the ground and measure soil moisture and tell the controller to go on based on the moisture in the soil versus the rain, those discs getting wet in your rain sensor. So it is also covered 100% up to $200 or $250, I think. And then we have some repair and retrofit systems for the irrigation or replacement systems. So this is when you would get a mobile irrigation lab visit. So we would come out, look at your irrigation and landscape, make recommendations on how to be more water conserving, and then you would make those changes. You would need to make those changes entirely. And then if so, you may be able to qualify for one of these rebates to help you with the cost of repairing or replacing your irrigation system, again, so that it's more water conserving. There's also a landscape retrofit. It does go hand in hand with the irrigation retrofit or replacement. And things like mulch or drought tolerant plants can be covered under this retrofit. So if you have any questions about the rebate program, feel free to send us an email, give us a call. We're happy to cover that with you. I want to go over a program that we have here in Manatee County as well as statewide called the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. It's a 9-principle program that talks about just smart things to do in your yard. And the very first principle is right plant, right place. There's a reason why it's number 1. We'll cover it in just a little bit, but it is the most important. And today's topic is really talking about right plant, right place for those drought tolerant type plants. The Florida Friendly Landscaping Program also covers things like watering efficiently, mulching, recycling, fertilizing appropriately, managing your pests responsibly, managing stormwater, attracting wildlife, and of course, protecting our waterfront. So right plant, right place, what does that mean? Well, when you go to the store, let's say you go to one of our big box stores, and there's this beautiful purple plant sitting right by the cashier. And you pick up that plant and take it home, and you put it right by the front door. And then a day or two, that plant's doing a little bleh, right? It's not looking so good. What are some of our first instincts? Can you guys just go ahead and chat? What would be the first thing you might do if you bring a plant home, plant it, and it starts to take a dive on you? And I'll give just a minute for some of you to type in the chat. By the way, when you do type in the chat, there's a button. You can chat to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you want it to just be to me, then change it to panelists. If you don't mind that everybody sees your responses, then go ahead and change it to panelists and attendees. Okay, so water it might be something that somebody does. Yeah, and somebody's saying lighting requirements. That's a great one. Some people might fertilize it. Some folks may check it for insects and bugs and give it a little preventative pest maintenance. And so, you know, the biggest issue, and the lighting requirement is a great answer, Claudia. So the biggest issue in this case is lighting. And so that beautiful purple plant that we picked up, and we wanted to show it off, so we planted it right by the front door. Did we look and see where the plant really wanted to be planted? So I didn't talk about that. And that's really the number one thing that we should be doing with our plants, is where do they want to be planted? Because they won't thrive in all locations in your yard. And so at the big box stores, we have to be careful sometimes because they buy regionally, and their region incorporates numbers of states, not just Florida. So sometimes there are actually plants in the stores that are for North Carolina, and they're just not going to do well here. Sometimes it's a full shade plant and we're planting it in full sun, and it's never going to do well in that location. So yes, always looking for what that plant needs and what your site conditions hold, and trying to marry those two things together. That's the goal. When you do that, the great news is you can usually reduce the amount of water, fertilizer, and pesticide required for that plant, because now it's in a happy spot. And just like you, if you go for days, which I'll fess up and tell you, I'm just getting over COVID myself. I was just cleared yesterday to come back to work. So I'm coming to you from my home. And I have not been eating well, or getting the proper amount of rest. Well, actually, I probably have gotten a lot of rest, but I have not been eating well. And so for me to go out right now, it would be, I could pick up something else very easily because my immune system's pretty low right now. Same with the plants. If we're putting plants in the wrong place, they're not able to get what they need. So when they can't get what they need, then they're really susceptible to other problems, other pest problems. So in that case, they may not be able to defend off disease as readily as they could if they were, had everything that they needed. So that could require them to need more pesticide and fertilizer. If a plant is planted in the wrong pH, this happens a lot with gardenias, those beautiful white, smelly, fragrant flowers that we love. They really kind of like a lower pH soil, and in our area we commonly have a little bit higher pH soil, and so they typically will show signs of fertilizer deficiency, nutrient deficiency, and then they need some fertilizer. But if they were planted in the appropriate place, they may not need that fertilization because they would be able to get what they need out of the soil due to the proper pH. Okay, sorry, I've spent a lot of time on that topic, but I told you it was important. Watering efficiently is also important because it can do a number of things. Number one, it protects our natural resource water, which we all definitely want to support. Protecting that resource. We all need to do as much as we can there. But another thing that happens when we overwater is we cause runoff from our landscape. So as we're watering, we're actually pushing the water out of the landscape. And when we push that water out, we're also pushing out any fertilizers or pesticides that may be on the lawn. So then that ends up running out into our bodies of water and causes problems. And I'm sorry, I hear Oh, excuse me, one moment. Sorry, my daughter has just come back from a run and my dog is going crazy, so sorry for the background noise there. So it pushes out those fertilizers and pesticides and pushes it into the stormwater, and that stormwater could go into the pond in your backyard, or it could end up in our stormwater system, but it can actually cause water pollution by overwatering. Not only that, but our plants don't really need that much water, and they can end up getting diseased due to the overwater. So we want to just make sure that we're following all of our water restrictions. And when we have these times like we've been having here lately, where we've had a lot of rain, then we want to make sure that we're turning off the system so it's not running, or that we have a functioning rain shutoff device on there. Okay. So the average or the statistic is 50% of your water bill is actually going towards irrigation. So if you're like on our county utilities, 50% of your bill is being used outside is the statistic. So you know, you don't want to pay for that water. If you're paying for potable water, you're actually paying for sewage on that water too. So it can be a little expensive. So you want to save money, but not just save money. You could really help your plants out, keeping them healthier if you treat them like it's a drought situation. We always talk about, we always want to treat our plants like we're preparing for a drought, because we never know when that's going to happen. Whoops. So I can hear that they're out in the pool. I hope you cannot hear that too. Okay, so once the right plant is established, irrigation can be reduced. A lot of times irrigation is put in just for the establishment of plants, and then we don't ever turn it off. So those shrubs right up next to your home, those typically only need to be irrigated until they get established, and then that whole zone can be shut off. When we're irrigating our turf, those shrubs, their root systems are going out into those turf areas. So the shrubs will get water when you irrigate that turf. This is a nice shady berm, and there really is not any irrigation set up here. They used a water truck to establish this initially. It's in a common area of a community, and once it was established, then thank you for the comment about the dog noise. Once this area was established, then there was, you know, really no supplemental irrigation installed. So it's a nice little shade collection of plants here. Using micro irrigation is what we want to strive to do in the landscape beds. It's the most water conserving type of irrigation, and it's really suited for those landscape beds. It gets the water right where it's needed, instead of, you know, those big sprays or broadcasts of water. It puts it right to the right spot where it's needed, and it's very efficient. Fertilizing appropriately is always a good goal. University of Florida has recommendations for fertilizer use. We can tell you based on not only the type of turf you have, but your level of maintenance. Some people want it to look like Disney in their yard. Some people are like, well, as long as it's green, I'm good. So there's even different recommendations based on what level of maintenance you would prefer. So we would encourage you to use our recommendations, always protecting our water, leaving a 10-foot maintenance free, we call it, zone around bodies of water where you're not going to apply fertilizer or pesticides in those areas. Mulching is wonderful. It can help retain moisture to the plant, and that's really important. And it can also help with the soil temperatures. When we have those super hot days, it's like a blanket keeping the soil temperature at its more normal temperature, instead of the sun really heating up that soil right there at the root ball of those plants and causing problems. And again, I apologize for the dog noise. My daughter went for a run and found a stray little girl puppy running around who's tagged. She's called and we're waiting for the owner. But in the meantime, my dog and that dog are having a wonderful time in the pool I hear out there. Supervised, of course. Okay, attracting wildlife. We're always going to want to attract wildlife into our garden, thinking about what was here before we came in, right? There was plenty of food for wildlife, and then we come in and wipe the slate clean. And do we put back sources of food for them? Well, we want to try to as best we can. The berrying plants for birds, nectar plants for our pollinators. You know, there's lots of great color choices. There's lots of, you know, great things that you can choose to put into your landscape for this. I've done it here in my own yard where we've planted islands. I have a couple of acres, and so instead of just, you know, one big open green space, we've planted these little islands here, there, and everywhere around the landscape, and it really helps for the birds, like the cardinals and the blue jays. They hop from little island to island, and in those islands we have things like firebush and hollies and things like that that they can stop and, you know, grab some food and then go on to the next one. So it's not only good for their food, it's good for a little protection from other animals too. Managing our yard pests responsibly. We always encourage the least toxic method first. So, you know, soaps and oils. We also don't encourage people to get the pest maintenance on a monthly basis. The folks that come into your yard and spray for just because it's the 15th of the month, you know, that's really just not a responsible management tool. What is responsible is a monthly service that knows how to scout for pests and come in once a month and scout your plants. And if you have a problem, then they address the problem. But if you don't have a problem, then you're paying them for the knowledge of knowing that, you know, we're watching this. If it's worse next time we come back, we'll spray. You know, so you're really paying for that knowledge. We call it IPM, or integrated pest management, and it's using a lot of different tools in a toolbox instead of just grabbing that, you know, spray bottle and hitting the yard or the house every 15th of the month just because it's the 15th of the month. We need to have a reason to spray. Recycling in our landscape is a great thing. We, you know, can turn all of those leaves and food scraps and all into a nice little nutrient boost for our plants. So composting is a good thing. Another way to recycle, though, is if you have like a large tree, maybe a large oak tree, and it drops its leaves. Usually twice a year, our oak trees really do a big drop. And instead of trying to rake up all those leaves and maintain grass under that area, which is always going to be a challenge because of the shade and the moisture under there, we just have established self-mulching beds. So directly under the trees where those leaves fall down. I'm sorry, excuse me one moment. Sorry about that. Okay, so self-mulching beds. The leaves can fall down in the, you know, right where they're at. They can fall and just stay there. You can plant some plants underneath the trees, and then they, you know, the leaves just become mulch for you. It's a lovely concept, I got to tell you. Reducing stormwater runoff is the 8th principle. We always want to pay attention what is going down the drain. We don't want to be dumping things out onto our driveway or out into the roadway, which is going to cause problems, and all of that stuff get carried off into our stormwater. Okay, protecting the waterfront is, again, leaving that maintenance-free zone of at least 10 feet around bodies of water where um, we're not putting fertilizer or pesticide in that area. We're going to keep grass clippings away from bodies of water and out of the storm drains. Why do we want to worry about grass clippings? Feel free to chat something to me. It's been a minute since I've had you type in. Why do we want to keep our grass clippings out? All right. Well, I'm glad I asked this question because grass clippings are taking from the soils to make themselves grow nutrient. So they're taking some nitrogen, some phosphorus, and some potassium and putting it up into the leaf, and that's how they make themselves grow, which is why we buy products with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in them to make the grass grow. Now, in Manatee County, there is a fertilizer ordinance, so you cannot use phosphorus in your fertilizer, and that's because we have phosphorus in our soils. And so it's felt by our county commissioners that we should not add any more phosphorus to the land because it can run off into the water and cause water pollution. So no phosphorus for containing fertilizers. But we buy fertilizer to put it on the grass to make it grow. And that fertilizer gets into the grass. So when you trim the grass, you know, you've got these grass trimmings, they're like little bits of fertilizer. And so if they end up in the water or in our storm water, which goes into bodies of water, it ends up looking like this. Because they have all this nutrient in them and the grass clippings, and it can cause this algae to start growing in our water. And you can actually see right here on this floating mat of algae, there's actually, look at this, these are grass clippings right here. So we find this all the time. Here's some more over here. We find this all the time, and there's been times that we've gone into communities on a weekend to do water sampling, and we can't get a clean sample because there's so many grass clippings floating on top of the ponds and lakes in the communities that we can't even get a clean sample. So it's really a problem, and we want to make sure that we're directing all that mower. If you still have the kind of mower that blows, it definitely needs to be directed away from bodies of water. After you mow, they should be, or you should be sweeping or blowing back all the grass clippings into the yard. The yard can use that nutrient, right? We're just recycling nutrients then. So the landscape can use all that stuff. But once it gets in the water, then it's going to create, you know, this algae problem because it's putting nutrient in the water. All right, so let's talk about drought tolerant plants and a little bit about what that means, that word drought. So really drought is the absence of rainfall for periods of time. So during that time, there's less soil moisture. If you don't have plants that are equipped to survive that type of period, then sometimes you can injure or you know, even lose your plants during that time. So what is drought stress? Well, drought stress is when the plants actually begin to lose their ability to absorb water. Their root systems almost like start shutting down because they are in such drought that they're, you know, just leaving the main root systems in place to survive. And so they're not as able to take up water once they get into a really stressed capacity. And it takes them a little bit once they recover from drought stress to be able to, you know, function normally again. So drought stress can cause problems to plants because, you know, basically it's putting it into kind of like a shutdown mode, and it's only doing what it has to do to survive. So, you know, it may lose leaves, it may turn a different color. It's just trying to hold on to survive. Now, this is drought stress. This is, you know, past the point of drought tolerance. Now we're in a very droughty condition and the plants are starting to show drought stress. So how long in this droughty condition before this drought stress really starts to develop? Well, it depends on a number of things. Some of it depends on your soil. Some of it depends on the plant itself. Is it still establishing? Is it a very small plant? Is it a woody plant? So unfortunately, I can't give you an answer exactly for each plant. When will it start to show drought stress? Because it's pretty variable on a number of things. The past few days, we've had some pretty windy conditions, and so that can hit a plant pretty hard too. And sometimes it can show some drought stress because of high winds. That wind constantly beating on it will pull moisture right out of the plant and put it into a drought stress situation too. Okay, so things that really can impact that drought stress are your light intensities. Is it super, super hot and dry? Here in our area, Manatee County, we're fortunate in that we don't typically have both really, really hot and dry at the same time. When it's really, really hot, it's in the middle of our summer, which is when we have a lot of humidity and often afternoon rains. So we're fortunate that we don't experience those two things together a lot. Really high temperatures, again, our summer months, but that gets balanced off here a lot of times because we have a lot of humidity or rain events that happen during those super high temperature times. Humidity can, if we have days of very low humidity, which today, don't know if you went outside this morning, it's gorgeous out there. We have a little lower humidity, so we can feel that, and it feels cooler and drier out there. Wind can be a real problem this time of year, especially when the winds really pick up. That can, pull that moisture right out of plants. So if a plant has been in a drought stressed situation, recently, then it's more likely to go right back into that situation if we're not careful, keeping an eye on it. So we want to be sure that if we've had the situation, we want to protect our plants for a while until they recover from it. So how do we reduce the effects of drought stress? Well, that would be with irrigation, supplemental irrigation. So irrigation is really, this is the big reveal. Irrigation is really just to fill in for times between rain. It's really not supposed to just go off every Monday and Thursday or Wednesday and Saturday. It really is supplemental irrigation, and it's to provide moisture between rain occurrences. So when we do have the dry times, like in the fall, that it helps, fill in between rain events. And using the micro irrigation is really the best choice. It's the most water conserving way to irrigate plants in landscape beds. Mulch is another great way to help with the drought stress. Again, it holds that moisture to the root ball of the plants, so it can help them keep some moisture, which is great. Providing a little shade. If you have a really hot landscape, let's say you're on the corner and it's just very open, not a lot of shade, you might want to look for ways to try to establish a little bit of shade. You've got, if you're on a corner, you've got 2 roadways, probably 2 sidewalks, and then your home, which reflects heat as well. All those things can heat up and pull moisture out of the landscape pretty quickly. Creating windbreaks. If you're in a area, let's say maybe on the waterfront, where it can be windy all the time, putting some shrubs up and creating a little bit of a windbreak can help reduce some of that drought stress too. But one of the other things that we can do is look for drought tolerant plants. Now, drought tolerant plants aren't plants that you can just plant and forget about. Okay, they're not, because they're drought tolerant, I never need to water them type of plants. They just can withstand longer periods without rainfall than a more conventional or typical type of plant. They've evolved in areas where it is frequently droughty, so like our pine flatlands, or our higher scrub areas where it, it just has to, nobody's out there irrigating it, so it has to survive through droughty times of the, fall and sometimes spring when we don't have a lot of irrigation. Excuse me one moment. So sometimes the plants themselves have evolved in a way that they can withstand drought better. They've gotten spines or they have leaves that store water. So sometimes they have some water storage capacity within the plant itself. Sometimes plants have very large root systems and can absorb water, or their root systems can go very deep. And so even though the top layers of soil have dried out, those deeper layers of soil still have some moisture that the plants can tap into. Sometimes the plants may have little hairs which help them hold on to some of their moisture. It helps reduce evaporation. And some of them have thicker cuticles, or skin on the plant itself. It's thicker so that it can hold that moisture in the plant. Calusa is and pitchapple are really known for that. You can feel those leaves. They feel kind of rubbery and thick. It's just an adaptation to help them through those droughty times. And then there's some plants that just grow kind of minimalistic, and don't grow a lot of leaves to begin with. And that's their response to being able to hold out through droughty times. And desert rose is one of those. They're not really a big leafy plant. They, have a few leaves and then some beautiful flowers, but they're not, like a big bush. They grow very small. When I say small, I don't mean small necessarily in size, but they don't grow a lot of vegetation. And that's kind of an effort on their part to just conserve water as much as they can. Here's another little one. Sedum is one that it's all, like in that succulent family where it holds water in the leaves. Railroad vine is very good at being drought tolerant. You find it on the coastal dunes typically, or if you're here in Manatee County and you've been to the new Costco, they've used it in the medians of the Costco, and it is very pretty. However, I'm not sure that they remembered how quickly it grows. It can grow, those vines can grow 100 feet, and in a median, that's going to be problematic. They're going to be constantly pruning that back. So we'll see how long it lasts in the medians at Costco. Bromeliads are another very good drought tolerant option. There are full sun bromeliads, and then there's shade bromeliads. So you can use different varieties in the different areas that you have. They, don't really root in so much. They put a few roots out just for stability, but they're not really rooted into the ground to take up moisture and nutrients. They pull what they need out of the air and rainfall. Juniper is a good, like, woody type plant that is a very good drought tolerant plant just because of its hardiness. Good woody plant. Ice plant, it's another one of those type of succulents that very pretty, beautiful flower on it. Frog fruit is what most people call a weed. Actually, what's one of its common names too is matchweed, and it's super drought tolerant, and you can find it sometimes in your yard, but I've found it in medians, unmaintained medians that you just maybe see some green vegetation in there. Sometimes it can take over the whole median, and it's quite lovely. These little white flowers actually attract some pollinators too. So not only is it hardier than turf, its root system goes deeper than turf, so it can last longer through a drought than turf. It also provides some benefit to some pollinators, which is a good bonus. Purslane is another nice little drought tolerant plant. It kind of acts as a succulent as well with the, water storage in the leaf. Purslane comes in a couple of different colors. You can find it in nurseries growing nice ground cover. Our beach sunflower is very drought tolerant, found on coastal dunes again, growing in nature where there is no irrigation. One of the problems that we actually find with this plant is that it gets over irrigated in the landscape and then it gets diseased. So if you go with beach sunflower, make sure you're putting it in a high dry place and don't put a lot of irrigation on it. It is a nice drought tolerant plant. Woolbine is another great little ground cover. Again, a lot of these ground covers are nice instead of turf in some areas because their root systems go deeper than turf, and so they can hold. They can go deeper down into the soil levels where there's still moisture. So sometimes our turf is going to need irrigation when these ground covers don't. So you're not really going to see me talk about drought tolerant turf because it's not really something that we've developed well yet. We're working on it. Lots and lots of research going towards turf studies and trying to find some really drought tolerant species. But as of recent, we don't have a variety that's commercially available that is maintained in a landscape like in a community landscape. So what we can do is work with our communities, our HOAs, and make sure we're working within the appropriate rules and try to reduce some of the turf areas that give us problems and replace it with some ground covers. And the drought tolerant would be a good option if you're having problems with your turf. So another plant that if you just want some green color, is the beach creeper. Sorry, I've got some boxes open here so I can see if you guys chat, and it ended up being right over the words this time. So beach creeper, it doesn't really get much of a flower. You're not going to notice any flower on it. It's just this kind of green creeping plant. Mats up, super drought tolerant, likes those coastal type soils. Purple heart is another one that it kind of feels like the succulent. You can see it here under this palm tree or a little splotch of it in this landscape bed here. It propagates pretty easily. It doesn't need a deep root system, and it just kind of establishes and takes off. It doesn't need a lot of water. Of course, it's drought tolerant. But it adds some color into your landscape just by having a different leaf color, which is nice sometimes too. Gaillardia is a blanket flower, is another name for Gaillardia. Now the Gaillardia in this picture is located back here. This is Blazing Star, which is a different wildflower, but Gaillardia acts like a ground cover, and kind of spreads out. Again, drought tolerant, beautiful colors. So nice option in the landscape. Twin flower, this is not the Mexican petunia, okay? It looks a lot like it, but this is actually our native plant that is the other option for that versus that Mexican petunia, which can be a real problem in the landscape. And we'll talk about why that is in that plant in particular in a little bit. Kunti is a little bit taller plant for us. That's a great drought tolerant plant. Kunti has lots of interesting stories going back to Native Americans who used the root systems. They would grind it down and use it as a powder and make bread, like a flour, and breads and things out of it. It's also a good pollinator plant. And we also call it a host plant. So it will actually host the mealybug destroyer on it, which is a great beneficial insect. Mealybugs are not good insects, but mealybug destroyers are. So they look very much alike, but very often you can find mealybug destroyers on your Kunti. And which means that they're kind of there sitting and waiting. And when mealybugs appear out in the landscape, then they'll move in on the mealybugs and eat them, which is always a great thing in the landscape. Dwarf Schefflera is another really strong drought tolerant plant. It's woody, so it can last for a good while. Even when it does show some drought stress, it tends to recover from it pretty quickly. Nice color. There's different colors. You can get the dark green variety, or you can get this variegated variety here, which adds a little color in the landscape. And I find that it does pretty decent in shade as well. So if you have a really dark shady area, it provides a little light in that area, which is nice. Firecracker, lots of color on this one. It can get pretty tall, up to 4 or 5 feet, and just lots of good red color here. Very thin little leaf structure, so it doesn't need a lot of water to maintain its leaf systems. Great plant in the landscape. Plumbago, you can find a plumbago in white or blue. It's very airy. It kind of just lays down. Beautiful plant. What we typically find with this plant is it's gotten too much water. We find it in irrigated landscapes, and it ends up, with kind of disease and dieback because it's been overwatered. It really likes it dry, really, really likes dry feet. Firebush is another great selection, more on the shrubby selection for your landscape that's drought tolerant. Firebush can get pretty big. It can actually get like 12 feet tall, but it can also operate or be maintained at a low, maybe 5 feet, 4 feet, and still do well. It responds well to pruning. So you can keep it in a smaller area of the yard, or you can let it be your windbreak or your fence. I really enjoy our firebush in our landscape because it attracts hummingbirds. I'm in Parrish, and so I don't know if you'll experience hummingbirds in all of Manatee County, but we do get them here every year on our firebush. So we like to enjoy that. These red tubular flowers are what really kind of invite hummingbirds into your landscape. So, but great drought tolerant plant, attracts wildlife not only for the nectar on the flowers, but those flowers turn to a seed and the birds and other wildlife enjoy those. Fakahatchee grass. Fakahatchee grass comes in both dwarf and standard, I guess. The dwarf only gets to be about 3.5, 4 foot tall, where the more common or standard Fakahatchee grass can get up to be about 6 to 7 feet tall. It's a clumping ornamental grass, so you can use it as a like a base in the landscape, a background, a nice green background. It provides a different form and texture than a lot of our other plants do. So it's a good little asset to have in there, very drought tolerant. There we go, muley grass. Now this is muley grass in its finest. It doesn't always look like this, but when it does, it's a beauty. And it typically does this in the fall and then again in the spring. It'll put off its seed heads, and that's what you're seeing. That pink is actually the seed heads on the muley grass, and they're just beautiful. They go through kind of a, you can see here, a dark pink to a light pink as they progress through time. Nice drought tolerant plant. Cordgrass, another ornamental grass that can be utilized. This one stays green. It's a clumping grass. Nice drought tolerant plant. Necklace pod is a more on the shrub. It can actually be a small tree as well. Good drought tolerant plant. You'll need to be considerate of site conditions in our area, however. If you're in Parrish, Mayaca, Lakewood Ranch area, necklace pod may not be the right choice for you. It is a zone 10 plant. If you're in West Bradenton or our island communities, then necklace pod is an appropriate plant for you. So again, it's not just about the beautiful plant that we find. We got to make sure that we're matching the conditions that we have to the conditions of the plants. And these plants are drought tolerant. So these plants are not going to go in that low spot in your yard, right? Where it's wet all the time, because they'll end up with disease. They'll end up with fungus if they stay wet, have wet feet for too long. Wild coffee is another great plant out there. It gets a little white flower on it, and then these red berries that the wildlife really do enjoy. Wild coffee grows best in a little filtered shade area. It can grow in full sun too. I find it growing, thriving in those kind of filtered shaded areas. So the question came up, can you grow this in a container? Let me go back to the plant before. Oh, necklace pod. Yes, you could grow a necklace pod in a container. You just need to make sure, that its root system has enough space, but I have seen it in containers before. So wild coffee, dark, shiny leaf, very pretty in the landscape. Good for wildlife, attracting in wildlife. I do want you to note its botanical name here, Psychotria nervosa. That comes from these red berries that have been used in Native American ceremonies that induce vomiting, and then they would have maybe almost, I hate to say delusion. I don't want to go into that. So, but what I will say is it does induce vomiting. Don't eat the berries. The Native Americans did use them in some ceremonies, and that's what they were trying to achieve, but we would never recommend that for anyone. But yes, it got its name from that red berry, so be careful there. Wildlife can eat them just fine, just not humans. And I would caution pets too. Walter's viburnum is a native shrub that we have here. It's got a smaller little leaf to it. In the springtime, it puts off these beautiful white flowers, very attractive to pollinators. They really like those flowers. Nice shrub plant. And beautyberry. Beautyberry is beautiful, but again, it's one of those plants that does its thing a certain time of year, and this is the fall. So beautyberry will have leaves that come on during the summer, spring and summer, and then in the fall it puts off these beautiful red berries. When the berries fall off, the leaves fall off too. It just becomes like a sticky, meaning sticks out there. until spring when it does it all over again. So beautyberry is beautiful, but it also needs to be kind of hidden among other plants. It shouldn't be the accent plant in your landscape because it will go through a season where it doesn't look so great. So having it kind of hidden, and then all of a sudden in late summer, fall, you go, oh wow, there's that beautiful beautyberry. That's the best way to do beautyberry. Sweet almond bush, it can get rather large. Again, these white flowers, wonderful for pollinators. I would caution you though, because it does lose its leaves, so it's deciduous, and you'll want to be careful that you're not putting it, in a spotlight location and then it loses its leaves in the winter and you have a bare plant. So again, kind of mixing your plants, knowing those characteristics and mixing them with plants maybe behind it that stay, that are evergreen, then you don't notice that quite as much. Oleander can get very large. There's a dwarf variety too, but the standard oleander can get very large, very beautiful flowers that come on it. It flowers most of the year, very drought tolerant. Also, just as a note, very poisonous. Every part of this plant is poisonous, but only if you ingest it or burn it. So don't eat it and burn it and you'll be fine. But if you do have children or curious pets, this really is not the plant for you. Because if you feel, maybe your children will try to eat any part of this, it's pretty poisonous. Matter of fact, it's been known that people have used its branches for roasting hot dogs and have died from that. So you definitely want to be sure, if you're planting it in your landscape, that nobody's going to ingest it or smell the smoke while it's burning. But if you cannot do that, then it's a beautiful plant. They use it if you drive on 275 past the Skyway, from our side, the Manatee County side, go over the Skyway and into St. Petersburg. You'll see it planted very heavily in the medians, no irrigation, and does, great in that high wind, hot environment. The other thing that can happen with oleanders is they get a caterpillar on them. It's a black hairy caterpillar that comes on them. We have a very non-toxic solution for that caterpillar, which is called BT. It's not harmful to people, only harmful to caterpillars. So we can help you with that situation. Podocarpus can be a shrub, or it can be developed into a tree, very drought tolerant. When we get into some of our trees, a lot of them are drought tolerant just because their root systems can go so deep that they can access moisture, much further below. Bird of paradise is one of those, when it's blooming, it's the jewel of the landscape, right? But sometimes they don't get put in quite the right spot and they don't bloom as prolifically as they do in some other areas. So it's one of those that it can transplant pretty easily, and I always encourage people to try it in different spots if it's not performing well where they plant it. But it is a good drought tolerant, colorful addition to your landscape. I am looking at the time, and I've been talking at you for an hour. So I do just want to take maybe a 10-minute break for us so that everybody can get another cup of tea or water, use the restroom, and I will join you back here. We have a few more plants to go over, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about invasive plants, what they look like, and why we want to be careful and not buying those or choosing those. Okay, so let's take 10 minutes. That'll bring us back at 11:10, and I look forward to seeing you back here. Thanks. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your few-minute break there. Just a status update on the puppy. She's been picked up, so we're all good. So that's good news. All right, so some other ground covers that you can use. Aloe, Aloe has another little added benefit, and that is if you burn yourself, you can go out and nip out a little bit and use the gooey insides to help with your burns. And then agave. Agave is another very drought tolerant. I don't know that I would call it as much of a ground cover because it gets kind of large, but it can fill in like a ground cover. And then yucca is another very drought tolerant option in the landscape. You can get some different color going with the yucca sometimes. Same with agave. Agave, you can find some different colors in that sometimes as well. Dwarf natal plum. These are actually edible, but here's a little secret. Just because something's edible doesn't mean that you really want to go eat it. Sometimes they don't taste all that great. Some people like the natal plum once they ripen. That's your call. But not only is it good for humans, it's also good for wildlife. So they like to eat these plums off of here as well. There's a dwarf, and then there is a more standard variety. The dwarf is more of a ground covery, stays very low to the ground, and then the more standard is more shrub-like. Kalancha, I'm going to say that this is a good one. However, you do need to be careful because they can break off and end up in places that you might not want them necessarily. Good plant, just caution on that one. Jatropha is a really hardy small tree that you can utilize in your landscape. If you are in colder areas of Manatee County, it can experience a leaf drop in the wintertime. It does come back, however, pretty strong, but in our coastal areas or West Bradenton, you probably won't experience any leaf drop at all. It does get a berry on it. It is good for wildlife. It has a milky sap that can be an irritant, so when you prune it, it doesn't require a lot of pruning, but when it does require pruning, sometimes you need to be careful with that sap because it can irritate your skin. But nice hardy plant, pretty pest resistant. I have a couple in my landscape, and last year for the first time in, I don't know, 15 years that I've had it, it got mealybug. That's the first time anything has ever, I have got it in an area, there's no irrigation. It just is doing its own thing out there. And all of a sudden I noticed there was a leaf drop going on and saw the mealybug. So first time ever, but other than that, I have not experienced any problems with it. Good plant. The Royal Poinciana can be a very large tree and a quite lovely tree. The flowers here, these actually look like the dwarf Royal Poinciana flower because they have like the orange and yellows in them. The Royal Poinciana itself is typically like either a red, bright red flower or a yellow flower, but very drought tolerant. Again, these are zone 10 type plants, so you would want to be cautious of them in our interior areas of Manatee County. Bougainvillea, very strong drought tolerant plant. If it gets too much water, it dies. So it does not like wet feet. Likes it really high and dry. Found originally cascading over the limestone rocks and areas, but the biggest problem with the bougainvillea is knowing that there's thorns. So knowing that when you go to maintain them, and I'm not talking about little thorns, you know, these thorns, where's my hand? There it is. It can be this big. I've seen these thorns pop tractor tires before. So just beautiful, beautiful plant. The only pest problem that I know about in our area is a caterpillar that gets on them, again, easily controlled with BT. But knowing that these have huge thorns and putting them in a location that they can just do their own thing and not need pruning is a good idea. I see these a lot of times up right next to the garage or up next to someone's front door, and I'm sure it's because they're so beautiful that they want to show them off. However, these thorns hang out and they can scratch your visitors, but you maintaining it also will you'll experience the thorn too. So these are great plants, but you need to put them in the right place where you're not having to get in there and prune them all the time, or else you'll know what thorns really are. Bottle brush, there's the traditional bottle brush tree, and then there's the weeping bottle brush. Um, Beautiful trees. This bottle brush flower is where it got its name. It's recently been put onto a caution list, however, because it's in that family of, uh, now my brain's gonna go crazy. Oh, yeah, the one that's, dries up the Everglades and then became a real problem. We planted it all in the Everglades. Why can't I think of the name? You know what? It's gonna come up in a later slide, so I'm not gonna worry about it, but it is on a caution list currently. Tabebuia, a nice drought-tolerant tree. Tabebuia shows its color in the spring, so it first flowers with these beautiful either pink or yellow flowers, and then the leaves come on. The flowers will fall and the leaves will come on, and you will not have the color for most of the year, but in the spring it is a beautiful pow of color when they first come on. So it's another one of those plants that if you kind of, I say hide them, but not really hide them, put them in with other plants so that all of a sudden in the spring you're like, oh yeah, there it is. It's a nice surprise. And then in the winter it does drop its leaves, and is pretty barren for most of the winter. Summer and fall, green foliage on it, and then of course in the early spring it flowers out first. Japanese blueberry is a beautiful plant, nice dark rich color. Um, One thing I do want to caution you with the Japanese blueberry is that we are finding that it is sensitive to nematodes in our area. That takes a while for us to figure out. So this plant came in as a very strong landscape plant and has been planted a lot. And it takes a while for those nematodes to find it, and they're starting to find it some. So if you have this plant in your community and they're kind of randomly dying, then you might want to do what we call a nematode assay, which is a test for nematodes, and see if that's the problem. If so, there's not a lot you can do, unfortunately, except for replace with a nematode resistant plant. So it's not going to be problematic in all parts of Manatee County everywhere, but it just, if you have them in the area and you're having problems with them, that's one thing that I would check before I would plant any in my own landscape. Because if you have it in the area, then chances are it's going to happen in your yard as well. Crepe myrtles. Many of us are familiar with crepe myrtles. Great plant. A lot of people think that you have to prune these to get them to flower, and that is absolutely not true. You do not have to touch a crepe myrtle. They'll do fine all on their own. Beautiful flowers. They do go dormant in the wintertime. So they are sticks, and we have them very commonly in parking lots and medians, and they trim them heavily. And I call them chicken legs. They look like chicken legs out there in the wintertime, just sticks sticking up. The problem with that practice is if they are continuing to hit the tree, if you continue to prune the tree back to the same spot over and over and over again, it gets knuckled. The ends of the branches get these really gnarled knuckles on them, and over time it can actually cause them not to continue to grow from that point. So they do respond okay to pruning, but they need to be pruned in different areas, different years. And they don't need that harsh, knock them all the way back to just four little sticks sticking up either. They have gorgeous trunks once they're mature. They can have very interesting trunks. And so letting that trunk develop and pruning it to encourage that development, maybe thinning it out a little bit so you can see the trunk, those are great reasons to prune, but you don't have to come in and prune them every year. Sea grape is another wonderful drought tolerant plant, and sea grape has a very interesting trunk as well. I'm trying to move my little toolbar here so I can see if you can see that trunk down. No, not so much, down at the bottom there. So the sea grape has a kind of a smooth trunk to it, but it's got some color variation. It's really quite lovely if they're allowed to get big. Some people keep them pruned down as a small little shrub. Again, these grapes will turn to a dark purple color, and they are edible. Remember what I said about edible? They make sea grape jelly. So, if you put enough sugar with anything, you can eat it. That they do make other things. I think there's a wine made from them too. But it is good for wildlife. So there we go. Cabbage palm and pindo palm. Our palm trees are usually pretty drought tolerant. Most all palm trees are pretty drought tolerant. These happen to be natives, and just a good thing to try to utilize in the landscape. The pindo palm, you can see it has a little bit of a silvery color to it out there. Kind of sometimes it's a little bit bluish color to it. So that can be a little bit of an interest to break up the heavy greens in the landscape. Okay, so I wanted to show you some examples of drought tolerant plants, and so that's what we've been doing for a while now. But I also want to caution you about these invasive plants. And so we're going to talk about invasive plants and kind of what that all means. So invasive plants really there's a formal definition of a true invasive exotic plant that would put it then on a list. And when it gets put on that list, then it's really a problematic plant. And it's not allowed to be bought, sold, or traded, transported in any way, shape, or form. Now, why do we worry about that? Why do we make these lists? Well, these plants don't have any natural predators out there. So there's nothing eating these plants and keeping them in check. So they end up taking over, and they take over our native species. They out-compete them. They grow taller than them, take their light, take their nutrients, take their moisture, and end up, crowding out our native plants. And then we're just left with these invasive plants that really have no benefit because there's no predator for them. And so things like Brazilian pepper, which I'm sure you're familiar with that one, that's just everywhere and there's nothing keeping it in check. These are the types of plants that we're talking about when we talk about invasive. So there's a lot of many types of invasive species that can grow in Florida. We have, a great growing climate here. So we're the king when it comes to invasive plants, typically. We have a lot of non-native plants, but non-native or exotic plants are not the same as invasive plants, okay? Invasive plants actually end up taking over. Our non-native plants just mean that they're not necessarily from Florida. There's a lot of Florida-friendly plants that are not native plants, but they're still okay to be out in the landscape. They still provide something for the wildlife. They're fairly drought tolerant, pest resistant. However, they're not going to take over in the landscape, those Florida-friendly exotic plants. But when we're talking about invasive plants, we're talking about plants that actually invade our native plants and take over. So you can see a picture here. This is, what is this? This is kudzu. That's what it looks like, yes. So kudzu, just, you know, mapping, matting and falling over, you know, big forest area and just killing it out. That's a problem. And then there's nothing that comes along and eats it or keeps it in check. So it just keeps going and going and going. And it can cost us billions of dollars to try to control this plant because it can threaten our crops. It can threaten waterways, choke up our waterways. You know, it can just really become a problem. So things that we can try to do to reduce this problem are always good. So as you can see, it's a pretty serious problem. There's some statistics here. So I'll kind of let you look over those, but yes, it's a very economically important issue in Florida, is trying to control our invasive exotic plants. Okay, so who calls them invasive? Who gets to say that they're invasive? And then making them illegal to buy, sell, trade, transport, have in your possession, period. So that would be the United States Department of Agriculture, along with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation. Typically, those are the two agencies that make this determination based on the economic impacts of the plant, based on its occurrence in Florida. There is the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services that's involved as well, and that's, I should be FDACS, but they can be involved as well, and they circulate the information. But who generally makes the determination is the USDA and the FWC. So we also have some information on plants out there that is a further tool. So the information from the USDA and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission would be those plants that are like they're the dirtiest plants, period, right? The worst ones. They're the ones that are illegal to buy, sell, trade, transport, or have in your possession. We have some predictors or some lists of plants that we are watching that we know to be problems, but haven't been put on any, illegal plant list yet. And so University of Florida has a list that we keep, or reports that we keep, and the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council also does. We call it FLEPC for short. They're different in how these lists are constructed. So the University of Florida actually uses, we use not only models, but observations and predictors before a plant will go on our list. It doesn't just randomly appear on our list. There's evidence that this plant is going to be a problem before it makes our list. FLEPC is a very commonly used list. They have been known to use observation. And so if somebody's hiking out through the woods and they see a plant and it looks like it's taking over, it might end up on their list. Where University of Florida's list isn't going to put it on the list until it's been documented in other areas, and that we know it to be a problem. So again, there is the invasive list that is the, top bad guys on the list that we cannot buy, sell, trade, anything. But then there are the lists from the University of Florida and from FLEPC that are, okay, these aren't the worst guys, but these guys are people, are plants that we're keeping an eye on because they could be a problem out in the landscape. So we want to keep an eye on them. And so where can you find this information? Well, University of Florida has the assessment of non-native plants. And when you go to our website, you can filter results right here. And so when you click on that button, you can filter by zone, by conclusion type, which is it a caution plant? Is it a, watch plant? You can filter by growth habitat, and then it will yield to you the results of plants that we're concerned about. Okay, so here are some listed down here, and then you can click on each plant and see, why, what the reason would be. So why do we worry about these? Why would we talk with you about them? Well, unfortunately, sometimes in local nurseries, there's plants that shouldn't really be being sold in the nursery. Sometimes they're in there because they've been erroneously identified. Um, if you have any of what we call these prohibited species, the illegal to buy, sell, transport, or trade, then we're always going to tell you to remove those plants, always, because you are creating a seed bank essentially in your landscape that's going to influence our natural areas, influence your neighbors, your neighborhood. So we would want that plant out, gone. And I actually went to somebody's house one day who had been out in the woods and found this beautiful flowering plant that was doing so well out in the woods that they pulled some of it and had propagated it in their landscape in several locations. And it was one of those prohibited species. And so what they did was illegal without knowing it, of course. They transported it, they had it in their possession. So yeah, that was a problem, but they just didn't know. And so this is why we're talking about it now, is to help educate folks as to what some of these plants are, what they look like. Prohibited species, we would recommend removal, but then there's caution species that we're going to say, it's up to you, but here's the problem that we found with this plant. So you get to make that determination. But in the nursery, you can find some of these plants. So Lantana chimera, which this is a beautiful flower. This is a very drought tolerant plant, and we can see the desire for folks to want to have these plants in their landscape. However, the base, these plants have been messed with genetically, and the base plant is Lantana chimera, which is a invasive plant, and it's very problematic. It's poisonous, and it causes problems with livestock all the time because it tends to grow like on fence rows and out in pastures, and so economically it's a very bad plant. Supposedly these are sterile. We've heard that before, and over time they tend to revert back and then can start producing seeds and all. So we would tell you on Lantana chimera to leave this on the shelf, not to purchase it. Mexican petunia is another one. It is not recommended. It's very aggressive. I'm not saying invasive, okay, but I'm saying aggressive. It's very aggressive. It crowds out other plants in your landscape. You plant it one place, you're going to find it in a lot of other places that you did not plant it. Again, there is a variety. It's called purple showers that is supposed to be sterile, but we have found over time it does revert back and starts producing seeds. Arrowhead vine is something that you'll find in a potted plant and a lot of times in like dish gardens and things. And that's fine if it's in a dish garden in a home or on a patio. But then, you know, us gardeners at heart, we can't just let these plants go. So we end up planting them out in our landscape and then they can become a real problem. This is very aggressive. It climbs up fences, it climbs up trees, and can become a problem out there. So if you get it in a dish garden, keep it in a dish garden. Don't plant it outside. Cardboard palm is one that you'll find for sale. They have like little saw blade edges on these little leaves here, these little leaflets, and they can cut you pretty good. Cardboard palm tends to get about 10 foot tall and about 15-foot wide. It gets very big, and a lot of times people don't know that, but the real problem is it seeds and it grows prolifically from seed. And so the wildlife transport, here's a little seed head right here. The wildlife will transport the seeds, and we are finding cardboard palm growing in places that it should never be, you know, in natural areas. And so then it becomes a problem because it gets established in those areas. So we have it on a caution list. We would not recommend purchasing cardboard palm. Golden pothos or pothos is another one that's an indoor plant. Great as an indoor plant. Actually has really good indoor air quality. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Qualities is, I guess, it's good for air quality indoors. It's one of the recommended plants to use in a workspace to help with filtration of air. So really good indoor plant, not so great outdoors. And this, you know, the climbing of the trees, and as it goes up to the top, it gets bigger and bigger and heavier. It holds moisture onto that tree trunk where it really doesn't need moisture, and it can be problematic for the trees. Just the weight alone can pull down branches. So not a plant that you want outside. It's fine indoors, just leave it indoors. Queen palm, queen palms are very common in the landscape, and this is what you find, these yellow berries that drop very, very prolifically, and the squirrels and raccoons and whatnot move them and plant them. And then we have queen palms coming up, and so we have queen palms coming up in natural areas. Queen palms are not a native palm. They shouldn't be in our natural areas. So we're calling it a caution plant because of the prolific seed drop, and then those seeds producing palms, and we're finding them in places they shouldn't be. Okay, so asparagus fern, and this is the one that we're talking about here, mixed in the pothos, which is the Springer rye is where I've heard it called before too, but this type of asparagus fern here, it's an invader, definitely, and you'll want to leave it in the nursery. Wooddalia, this little booger gets into your landscape sometimes without you knowing it. I know that from personal experience. I have a ditch along the front of my house, and it crept in through the ditch and crept up onto my property, and we've been battling with it ever since. It's very aggressive, invasive, and definitely recommended to not be planted. I think you can still, I know you can still buy this in nurseries. But once you have it, you will always have it. It's very aggressive and ends up in places, it's in a lot of our natural areas where we don't want it to be currently, and we fight to get rid of it. So there's wandering Jew, which is an invasive in South Florida, not recommended in South Florida, this variegated leaf. It's not the same as the purple heart that I showed you earlier. That's a solid purple leaf, different plant. And then there's a heartleaf philodendron that is also problematic, but both of these you can find for sale. So you'll want to be real careful on those. You don't want plants in your yard that you know, once you have them, you'll never get rid of them. And these tend to be those. Dish gardens are beautiful, and a lot of times we get them for either celebratory or for remembrance. And so sometimes we want to take those plants and plant them to help us remember loved ones that we may have received the dish garden for their funerals. And that's not a good idea. The dish gardens need to be left indoors. These are indoor plants, and they need to be left indoors. Not only that, this right here looks like an areca palm. Areca palms want to be like 35, 40 feet tall, 20 feet wide. So a lot of times people think because it's in a dish garden that it's a small little plant, and it's not. But the majority of plants in this dish garden really don't need to be out in our landscape. They're indoor plants. We need to leave them indoors. Okay, so we've got some spelled out for you here. We've got number 1 is the lucky bamboo or a dracaena. We've got a parlor palm here, gold dust dracaena here, the arrow vine here. This is that heartleaf philodendron. Actually, well, that's it too. The heartleaf philodendron. And then we have the prayer plant, number 6, which is that multicolored leaf there. So in this plant, you can see there's 6 different, in this planter, there's 6 different types of plants. And really none of them need to be in your landscape. They all really can do much better as an indoor plant. So we want to help to prevent the spread of those invasive or aggressive plants. And so we need your help in doing that, because they're, you know, we find them in the nursery all the time for sale. So we need you to help us in identifying the plants that you're purchasing, making sure that they're not caution plants, and putting them in your landscape. We're always going to recommend any caution or non-native plant to be removed from private property. Many of these invasive plants are considered weeds. Sometimes, like if you have a carrot wood in the neighborhood or a Brazilian pepper in the neighborhood, then you have shoots coming out in your landscape all the time from these. And removing them, you know, may seem like a pain, and it may seem like it gets overwhelming sometimes, but we would encourage you to do it, because if not, you know, you're again becoming a seed bank for these. And then, you know, even helping to educate your neighborhood, your neighbors. They may not understand that what they're growing is an invasive plant and causing the whole neighborhood a problem. So if you can find a kind, gentle way to do that, if you want to involve us, we're here to help. We can always help with that. When you do cut down a tree, the stump needs to be tended to prevent regrowth. When we're talking about a Brazilian pepper tree, the stump needs to be treated as soon as it's cut. You've got about 5 minutes before it hardens off, and the treatment would no longer be able to be absorbed into the tree. So when Brazilian peppers are cut down, that tree stump has to be treated immediately. And again, we are the University of Florida IFAS Extension, and we have lots of information on this. So if you're planning on doing some removal, get with us. We have lots of fact sheets that can help you, you know, do it in the best way, you know, using best management practices out there. So again, we're always going to encourage you to remove those invasive species from your landscape. And we're going to tell you that we would welcome you to have a Florida-friendly landscape, a Florida-friendly yard. And we have a program here in Manatee County. Susan Griffith is our Florida-friendly landscaping coordinator, and she can come out and check out your yard and award you one of these signs, but not if there's any invasive plants in the landscape. So make sure that you get those removed out. So here are some of the resources that I used for today's presentation. I have to say that Valrie Massey is a horticultural program assistant for the mobile irrigation lab, and she is who put this presentation together. She's out in the field today, so I gave the presentation, but Valrie worked very hard to put this information together, so I want to give her recognition for that. Okay, so if you do have any questions, we can use the chat because we haven't been real chatty today. So feel free to post questions. I'm happy to take any and all, and I want to thank you very much for your time and attendance today, and hopefully you learned about some new plants, maybe recognized some plants that you already knew, and can share some of this information with your friends, families, and neighbors. So I'm going to wait for questions. Again, thank you for your time. Yes, we do have composting class, and we have an Eventbrite website that you could go to get the information on the composting class. Or actually what I'll do, I'll send you our next class. I've got your name here, so I'll send you information on our next composting class. Our Florida Friendly Landscaping coordinator, Susan Griffith, teaches those classes, and great classes, so much information in those. All right, well, I'm going to hang out here for another couple of minutes. Again, thank you for your attendance today and listening to information. Hopefully, you'll make some positive changes in your landscape. And so someone's asking about the aloe plant that I showed in the picture. Doesn't look like the one in their landscape. There are different looks to aloe plants. Most of the time they're kind of a dark green with some yellow speckling on them. The edge of the plant is going to have some pokes on it, I call, almost like thorns. It comes to a point multiple times down the side of the plant. But there are a couple of different types of aloes, but in general they look a lot alike. You know, that very succulent, thick plant. Actually, I think I might be able to. I'm going to go onto the internet here and we'll look at some. So a little trick that we do is always type in UF and that typically yields us the information from the University of Florida. So let me go here. I'm not sure if you're able to see my screen, but if not, I'm going to share it right here. Okay, so you should be able to see the University of Florida's Gardening Solutions website here, and it's got information on aloe vera, and it's got some plants right here. So that looks a little different than the one that I showed because it's been in sun, where the one I showed was in full shade, so it was a lot darker. Aloe poisonous, I don't I don't want to say that they're not because I don't know 100%. I'd have to look that one up. Let's see if I can do that here real quick. And again, I typically type in UF aloe, and then that, I'm sorry, I'm having to move some of these boxes here. Oh, that brought me back to the same page. This is the one I want. We want the fact sheet. Here we go. That's actually one of my colleagues down south. Let's try this site. So I have a hard time, unfortunately, with the none are poisonous. I can't say that without doing more research on them. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. So when we talk about poison, I've got to be really careful, and I have to look up fact sheets to make sure that I'm accurate in what I'm saying. So I don't know. I know that in general, aloe is used, for a number of things. They actually even use aloe ingested. It's put in smoothies and stuff. But are all of them edible and able to be used medicinally? I don't know. I'm sorry.